She is a quiet thing, my stepmother, Lady Beatrix, said, her voice a confection of spun sugar and poison. Useful in her own way. She fetches things without complaint, a little mouse for the wainscoting. I was standing not 10 feet away, partially obscured by a potted fern, the fronds tickling my cheek like the ghosts of whispers. It was the annual Blackwood Ball, and I had been instructed to remain near the flora, to blend in, to become another shadow on the wall. My purpose was to be invisible, a task at which I had become painfully adept. The man she was speaking to, some florid-faced Viscount with eyes like wet stones, grunted in disinterest, his gaze already sliding past me toward my stepsister, Clarissa. Clarissa was the sun around which our family orbited. Her hair was spun gold, her laughter like the ringing of tiny silver bells, her beauty a currency that Beatrix spent with avarice and precision. Beside her, I was a faded watercolor, my features indistinct, my hair the color of dust, my silence a void. My father, a man long since hollowed out by grief and a desperate need for a quiet life, saw me as one might see a familiar piece of furniture, present but not truly noted. He had allowed Beatrix to become the architect of our lives, and she had built for me a prison of quiet neglect. The humiliation was a constant low-grade fever, but tonight it felt acute. Beatrix had plans for Clarissa, grand plans involving a marquis or perhaps an earl. My own future was a subject of much less scintillating speculation. Beatrix had recently found a potential match for me, Baron Grieve, a man whose lands were as barren as his soul, a creature of damp wool and sour breath who looked at me with the appraising eye of a man buying livestock. The match would secure a minor political alliance for my father, and more importantly, would remove me from the house. It would be my final useful act as a fetcher of things, fetching a future of misery for myself to grant my stepmother peace. So I stood by the fern, a silent sentinel to my own erasure, and watched the glittering society whirl by. I watched Clarissa charm the Viscount, her head tilted at the perfect angle. I watched my father nod absently at a conversation, his eyes distant. I watched Beatrix move through the crowd like a shark in silk, her smile a weapon. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and beeswax, a sweetness that choked me. I felt a familiar tightening in my chest, the desire to shrink until I simply ceased to exist, to fold myself into a space so small that no one's gaze could ever find me again. And then, the music seemed to falter. A hush fell over the grand ballroom, a wave of silence that rippled out from the great arched entryway. Every head turned. He had arrived. Duke Alaric Blackwood, the Iron Duke. He was a man forged from myth and shadow, the master of this very house, though he rarely graced it with his presence. He was impossibly wealthy, ruthlessly powerful, and utterly solitary. Stories clung to him like burrs, that his heart was a shard of ice, that a tragedy years ago, a fire that had consumed his ancestral home and his family with it, had burned away any capacity for warmth or joy. He was dressed in unforgiving black, a stark slash of midnight against the pastel silks of the room. His face was all sharp angles and severe lines, his expression a mask of cold neutrality. He looked like a storm cloud given human form. People parted before him as he moved, a sea of whispers and curtsied deference. Beatrix's eyes lit with a predatory gleam. The Duke was the ultimate prize, a king on the social chessboard, and though he was famously immune to charm, she would not be the one to shy from the attempt. She glided toward him, Clarissa a beautiful shining lure in her wake. I pressed myself further into the shadows of the fern, wishing the leaves could swallow me whole. The last thing I wanted was to be seen by such a man, to have his famously piercing gaze pass over me and find me wanting, just as everyone else did. I watched him from my hiding place. He moved with a kind of lethal stillness, his eyes scanning the room not with interest, but with a weary sort of assessment, as if he were cataloging every flaw. He acknowledged my stepmother with a curt, barely perceptible nod that dismissed her saccharine greeting before it was even fully formed. His gaze swept over Clarissa's radiant beauty without a flicker of interest. It was a masterful, brutal snub, and I saw a flash of fury in Beatrix's eyes before it was masked by another brittle smile. Her gaze, sharp with frustration, shot across the room and landed directly on me. It was a look of pure venom. I was a failure, a blot on her perfect canvas, a reminder that her household was not composed solely of glittering assets. I saw the thought form in her mind, the cruel, impulsive decision. She was going to make an example of me. She gestured, a flick of her wrist, and a footman approached her. She whispered in his ear, her eyes never leaving mine. The footman looked startled, then uncomfortable, but he nodded and began to move through the crowd. A horrible, cold dread washed over me. This was new. This was a public degradation, a different kind of cruelty than the quiet daily dismissals I was used to. The footman reached the orchestra leader. A moment later, the music stopped. A terrible silence descended again, but this time it was expectant. Beatrix's voice, now amplified by the quiet, rang out with false cheer. "My dear friends, as a bit of evening amusement, we shall hold a small auction. A dance with my quiet, scholarly stepdaughter, Alara. For the benefit of the Widows and Orphans Fund, of course. Who will start the bidding?" The world tilted. My blood ran cold, then hot with a shame so profound it felt like a physical blow. I was being sold. A joke prize, a pity dance for charity. Every eye in the room turned to me, hiding in my pathetic corner. I saw pity, amusement, and cold indifference on their faces. I felt stripped bare, my invisibility ripped away to reveal the worthless creature beneath. Clarissa looked horrified, her hand flying to her mouth. My father simply looked away, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "5 shillings, someone called out, followed by a titter of laughter. 10, another voice jeered. My breath hitched, I could not move. I was pinned by 100 gazes, a butterfly skewered to a board. I wanted to die. I wanted the floor to open up and swallow me. I closed my eyes, praying for an end to it. £1,000. The voice was not loud, but it cut through the room like a blade of Arctic wind. It was deep, resonant, and utterly devoid of amusement. My eyes snapped open. Every head had swiveled back toward the entrance. Duke Alaric Blackwood stood there, his expression unchanged, as if he had just commented on the weather. A collective gasp went through the assembly. £1,000. It was a fortune, an absurd, impossible sum for a single dance. It was enough to fund the charity for a decade. It was an insult to the very premise of the auction. Beatrix's jaw had gone slack. The jeering laughter died in the air, replaced by stunned, confused silence. The Duke's gaze, gray and unreadable as a winter sea, moved past my stepmother, past my sister, past everyone, and settled directly on me. He did not smile. He did not offer any hint of warmth. He simply looked at me, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly, terrifyingly seen. He took a slow step forward, then another. He walked directly to my corner, ignoring the shocked and gaping crowd. He stopped before me, so close I could see the flecks of silver in his dark gray eyes. He was taller than I had imagined, a formidable presence that seemed to absorb all the light and sound around him. He extended a gloved hand. "I believe," he said, his voice a low murmur meant only for me, "you owe me a dance, Miss Ashworth." My hand, when I placed it in his, was trembling. His grip was firm, cool, and steady. He led me from the shadows of the fern and onto the center of the vast, empty dance floor. He nodded to the petrified orchestra leader, who immediately struck up a slow, hesitant waltz. As he drew me into the formal posture of the dance, the world narrowed to the space between us. His hand was a firm, warm pressure on the small of my back. The whispers started then, a frantic, buzzing tide of speculation, but I could barely hear them. All I could feel was the shock, the bone-deep confusion. Why? The words screamed in my mind. Why me? Was this pity? A grand, cruel gesture to amplify my humiliation? A strategic move in some social game I couldn't comprehend? I searched his face for a clue, but it remained a fortress of stoic neutrality. He was an expert dancer, guiding me with an effortless precision that made my own clumsy steps feel almost graceful. We moved in silence for a long moment, the only sound the sweep of our feet on the polished floor and the swell of the music. "You are wondering why," he stated, not a question, but a fact. His voice was low, a rumble I felt in my chest. I could only manage a nod, my throat too tight for words. "Pity is a useless emotion," he said, as if reading my thoughts, "and I do not play games." His eyes held mine, and there was an intensity in them that was unnerving. 5 years ago, at the Royal Astronomical Society's annual lecture, a young woman stood up and asked Professor Albright a question about tidal locking in binary star systems, a question so insightful it rendered the old man speechless for a full minute, a question he later admitted had forced him to reconsider a key part of his own theory. The memory hit me with the force of a physical impact. I had been 18, dragged to the lecture by my father in one of his rare moments of paternal attention. I had been fascinated, and a question had burned in my mind, a question I had asked in a fit of intellectual boldness I had not felt before or since. I had been mortified by the ensuing silence, certain I had made a fool of myself. "That was you," the Duke said. His gaze did not waver. "I was there. I do not forget a mind like that." I stared at him, my heart hammering against my ribs. He remembered. Someone had seen past the plain face, the quiet demeanor, the drab dress. Someone had seen my mind, not as a curiosity, not as a flaw, but as something of worth, something to be remembered for 5 years. The idea was so foreign, so staggering, that I could not process it. The dance ended. He held my hand for a moment longer than was proper, his thumb brushing lightly against my knuckles. The sensation was like a spark on dry tinder. "Your stepmother," he said, his voice dropping even lower, "is a fool." And with that, he gave a slight bow, released my hand, and turned, walking away and leaving me standing alone in the center of the floor, the epicenter of a hurricane of gossip. The days that followed were a strange fever dream. Beatrix was incandescent with a rage she could not openly express. The Duke's public pointed act of favor had made me, for the moment, untouchable. To punish me now would be to question his judgment, something no one dared to do. So instead, she subjected me to a suffocating campaign of passive aggression. My books would go missing. My inkwell would be mysteriously empty. My mending would be criticized with a new, sharper venom. She was trying to reassert control, to remind me of my place, but something inside me had shifted. A tiny, fragile seed of hope had been planted in the barren soil of my self-worth. He remembered me. He had seen my mind. The words echoed in my thoughts, a constant, quiet hum beneath the surface of my days. I found myself replaying the dance, the feel of his hand, the intensity in his gray eyes. I told myself it was a whim, a passing fancy of a powerful man. To hope for more was to court devastation. I knew that. But the seed had already begun to sprout, sending out a terrifyingly delicate green shoot. A week after the ball, a package arrived. It was delivered by the Duke's own footman, a crisp, black-liveried man who handed the heavy vellum-wrapped parcel directly to me, ignoring Beatrix's outstretched hand. Inside was a book. Not just any book, but a first edition of Cassini's Celestial Atlas, a work of such rarity and value that I had only ever read about it. My hands trembled as I opened the cover. On the flyleaf, in a sharp, decisive hand, was a simple inscription. For a mind that looks at the stars. There was no signature. None was needed. I hid the book in my room, under a loose floorboard, a secret, precious treasure. It was a confirmation. It was not a whim. He had thought of me again. He had sought this out for me. The small act of kindness was more profound than any grand declaration. He had not sent flowers or jewels, the common currency of courtship. He had sent something that spoke to my soul. He had sent me a universe bound in leather. The next invitation came 2 days later. It was not for a ball or a soiree. It was a summons, penned in the same decisive script, to his city residence, Blackwood House, for tea, chaperoned by my father, of course. Beatrix was forced to agree. Her smile stretched so tight it looked painful. The Duke's favor was now undeniable, and to refuse would be a grave insult. She was caught in a trap of her own making. Blackwood House was like its master, imposing, severe, and utterly magnificent. It was a fortress of gray stone and dark wood, but inside it was not cold. It was quiet, filled with the scent of old paper and lemon polish. We were shown not to a formal drawing room, but to the library. My breath caught in my throat. It was 2 stories high, a cathedral of books with shelves stretching up into the shadows, accessible by a wrought-iron spiral staircase. A fire crackled in a hearth large enough to stand in. The Duke was waiting for us. He dismissed my father with polite efficiency, sending him off with his steward to discuss some matter of estate boundaries, a transparent but effective maneuver. And then we were alone. Alone in a room with 100,000 silent voices. "I trust the atlas was to your liking," he said, gesturing for me to sit in one of the deep leather armchairs by the fire. "It is the most wonderful gift I have ever received, Your Grace," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I don't know how to thank you." "By discussing it with me," he replied simply. He sat opposite me, the firelight catching the sharp planes of his face. "Tell me what you think of Huygens' theories on the rings of Saturn. I find his postulations on their composition to be incomplete." And so we talked. For 2 hours we spoke of astronomy, of mathematics, of the elegant, beautiful logic of the cosmos. He did not condescend. He did not simplify. He spoke to me as an equal, a peer. He listened to my ideas with a focused intensity that made me feel as if my words were the most important thing in the world. I found myself speaking with a confidence I did not know I possessed, the words flowing out of me, freed from the cage of my usual timidity. He had not just given me a book, he had given me back my voice. As I spoke, I watched him. The severity of his expression would soften when I made a particularly salient point. A faint hint of something that might have been a smile touched his lips once or twice. I was seeing past the facade of the Iron Duke, catching glimpses of the man beneath, a man with a brilliant, lonely mind that had found a kindred spirit. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. I started to notice small things, the way his hands, long-fingered and strong, would gesture as he described an orbital path, the way his focus was so absolute it felt like a physical force. He told me about his own passion, architecture. He was in the process of redesigning and rebuilding his ancestral home, Blackwood Manor, the one that had been destroyed in the fire. He spoke of structural integrity, of light and shadow, of creating spaces that were not just beautiful, but logical, harmonious. He saw the world, as I did, as a series of intricate, interconnected patterns. We were two cartographers mapping different worlds. Over the next few weeks, there were more meetings, walks in the park, chaperoned at a distance, visits to museums, more afternoons in his library. With each conversation, the fragile shoot of hope within me grew, unfurling into a leaf, then another. I was beginning to believe this was real. I was beginning to let myself feel something for this severe, brilliant, intense man who saw me in a way no one else ever had. He never spoke of feelings. His attentions were subtle, practical. He noticed I shivered on a cool day, and the next time we met, a fine cashmere shawl was draped over my chair. He learned of my love for a particular type of tea, and from then on, it was always served. These small kindnesses were more intimate than any flowery compliment. They were acts of observation, of paying attention. They were proof that I was not invisible to him. One afternoon, we were poring over a set of architectural drawings for his new manor. He was explaining the complex geometry of a vaulted ceiling, his finger tracing the lines on the heavy paper. My own hand lay near his, and in my eagerness to point something out, my fingers brushed against his. A jolt, sharp and electric, shot up my arm. He froze. I froze. The air thickened, suddenly charged with a tension that had nothing to do with architecture. He slowly, deliberately, turned his hand over and covered mine. His skin was warm, his touch surprisingly gentle. He held my hand there, resting on the blueprint of his future home, his thumb stroking the back of my hand in a slow, mesmerizing rhythm. His gray eyes met mine, and in their depths, I saw a flicker of something raw and vulnerable, a heat that belied his cold reputation. It was the look of a man who had been alone in a cold, dark room for a very long time and had just seen a candle being lit. It was that moment of connection, that silent, profound acknowledgement that gave Beatrix the weapon she needed. She must have seen the change in me, the light in my eyes that had not been there before. She saw that this was no longer a duke's passing whim, but something real. And a real connection between myself and the most powerful man in the country was a threat to all her plans for Clarissa, a threat to her control. She had to destroy it. The attack, when it came, was swift and brutal. I received a curt formal note from the Duke's secretary canceling our next planned meeting. No reason was given. Another day passed, then another, with only silence from Blackwood House. The silence was a living thing, a cold, heavy presence that settled in my chest and grew with each passing hour. Doubt, my old familiar companion, began to whisper in my ear. It had been a game after all. He had grown bored. I had imagined the warmth in his touch, the look in his eyes. I was a fool. Then my father summoned me to his study. He could not meet my eye. He looked older, more stooped than ever. Beatrix stood beside him, her expression a mask of feigned sympathy. "Alara," my father began, his voice strained. "An opportunity has arisen, a most suitable match. Baron Grieve has made a formal offer for your hand." The name was a punch to the gut. The damp, sour-breathed Baron. "No," I whispered, the word catching in my throat. "I will not." Beatrix stepped forward, her voice dripping with false concern. "My dear child, you must be practical. The Duke, well, it is clear his attentions have waned. Men of his stature are known for their fleeting interests. We cannot let this excellent opportunity with the Baron pass you by. The contracts are already being drawn up. The wedding will be in a fortnight." "No," I said again, louder this time. The hope he had given me had forged something new inside me, a spine. "I will not marry him." Beatrix's facade cracked. Her eyes narrowed. "You will do as you are told," she hissed, her voice low and sharp. "You are an ungrateful, plain little thing, and this is a far better match than you deserve. The Duke has forgotten you exist. I have it on the best authority that he is already considering other, more suitable prospects. Do you want to be left a spinster, a burden on this family forever?" Panic seized me. Was she right? Was the silence from him a confirmation of her words? The uncertainty was a physical torment. That evening, I did something I had never done. I took a piece of paper and with a trembling hand wrote a letter. "Your Grace," I wrote, my heart aching with every word. "I hope I do not presume, but your recent silence has caused me some distress. If I have given offense, I beg you to tell me how. If your interest has changed, I ask only for the courtesy of knowing it for certain. I'm being pressured into a match I cannot accept. Please. Alara Ashworth." I gave the letter to a stable boy I trusted, along with my last silver coin, and begged him to deliver it directly to Blackwood House. Then I waited. The hours crawled by. The next day, Beatrix informed me with a triumphant smirk that the dressmaker would be arriving to fit me for my wedding gown. Despair began to settle over me, heavy as a shroud. Late that afternoon, a reply came. It was not a letter. It was the Duke himself. His carriage, a sleek black lacquered machine pulled by 4 matching black horses, thundered to a stop before our house. He did not wait for the footman. He threw open the door himself and strode up the steps, his face a thundercloud of controlled fury. He did not ask for my father. He did not acknowledge the stunned butler. "Where is she?" he demanded, his voice echoing in the hall. I had heard the commotion from my room and had crept to the top of the stairs. Beatrix and my father rushed into the entryway, their faces a mixture of shock and fear. "Your Grace," Beatrix began, her voice trembling slightly. "What an unexpected—" He cut her off with a look so cold it could have frozen fire. "I will speak with Miss Ashworth, alone." He strode past them, his eyes finding me at the top of the stairs. "Alara, come down." It was the first time he had used my given name. It was not a request. It was a command, but one laced with a desperate urgency that sent a shock through my system. I descended the stairs, my legs unsteady. He met me at the bottom, his hands gently taking my arms, his eyes searching my face. Are you well?" he asked, his voice low and rough. "You spoke of being pressured." Before I could answer, Beatrix found her voice. "Your Grace, this is a family matter. My stepdaughter has been emotional. She has accepted a proposal from Baron Grieve. She is overwrought." She held up a letter. "In fact, she wrote to you just yesterday to end your acquaintance. She felt she was leading you on." The Duke took the letter she offered. I stared at it in horror. The handwriting was a passable forgery of my own. It was a cruel, dismissive letter, full of false sentiment, ending things with a cool finality. It spoke of my unworthiness and my desire not to embarrass him further. It was a masterpiece of sabotage. "I received this yesterday," he said, his voice dangerously calm as he looked from the letter to me. "And then your own true letter arrived this morning. An interesting contradiction." Beatrix paled. "The girl is confused." "The girl," the Duke interrupted, his voice dropping to a lethal quiet, "is the most intellectually honest person I have ever had the privilege of knowing. She does not play these kinds of games. But you do you not, Lady Beatrix?" He let go of my arms and took a step toward her. My father shrank back. "I do not know what you mean," she stammered. "Do you not?" He produced another set of documents from his coat pocket, tied with a black ribbon. "I have a very efficient staff. When I received this forgery, I had them look into your affairs. It is amazing what one can discover in 24 hours. For instance, that Lord Ashworth's finances are in a ruinous state, and that you have been systematically selling off parcels of land that were part of Alara's mother's dowry, lands held in trust for Alara herself, to fund your own ambitions." My father made a choked sound. "Beatrix, is this true?" "He's lying!" she shrieked, her mask of composure shattering completely. "It's all lies." "Is it?" The Duke's voice was relentless, each word a hammer blow. "My solicitor is currently meeting with Baron Grieve. He's explaining to the Baron that marrying Alara would not, in fact, bring him the relief from his debts that you promised, but would instead embroil him in a rather nasty legal battle over stolen property. A battle the Baron, a man of limited resources and even more limited courage, will have no appetite for. The engagement, I believe you will find, is already broken." Beatrix stared at him, her face a mask of hate and disbelief. All her schemes, all her manipulations, laid bare and dismantled in a matter of minutes. She had underestimated him. She had underestimated the lengths to which he would go. "And as for you, my lord," the Duke said, turning his cold gaze on my father, "you have stood by and allowed this woman to abuse your daughter, to steal from her, and to attempt to sell her into a miserable marriage. You have failed in your most basic duty as a father." My father crumpled, sinking into a nearby chair and burying his face in his hands. He wept. For the first time, I felt a sliver of pity for him, a man so weak he had allowed his world to be poisoned. Clarissa, who had appeared in the doorway, stared at her mother with wide, horrified eyes, as if seeing her for the first time. The Duke's attention returned to Beatrix, who was trembling with impotent fury. But before he could speak again, I found my voice. It rose from a place of deep, old pain, a voice I did not recognize as my own, clear and strong and utterly steady. "You called me a mouse," I said, looking directly at my stepmother. "Quiet and useful. You thought I was a shadow, something to be tidied away into a dark corner, but shadows see everything. I saw your cruelty, your jealousy of my mother's memory. I saw your greed. I saw how you used Clarissa's beauty as a weapon and my father's grief as a shield. You tried to make me believe I was worthless, a faded copy of a life. But you were wrong. I took a step forward, empowered by the Duke's solid presence behind me. My worth is not something you can bestow or take away. It is not in my face or my fortune. It is here." I tapped my temple. "It is in my mind, a place you could never hope to touch, let alone understand. You are the one who is empty, Beatrix, a beautiful, glittering, hollow shell, and I will not be haunted by you anymore." For a moment, there was only a ringing silence. Beatrix stared at me, speechless, defeated not by the Duke's power, but by the quiet girl who had finally refused to be invisible. The victory was mine. The Duke placed a hand on my shoulder. "Come, Alara," he said softly. "Let us leave this place." He led me out of the house, away from the wreckage of my old life, and helped me into his carriage. As the door closed, sealing us in our own quiet world, the dam of my control finally broke. I covered my face with my hands and wept. I wept for the years of loneliness, for the quiet pain, for the girl who had believed she was nothing. He did not speak. He simply moved to sit beside me and pulled me gently against his side. I leaned my head on his shoulder, his coat smelling of winter air and old books, and cried until there were no tears left. His arm was a solid, comforting weight around me. He was an anchor in the storm. When my sobs finally subsided, He used his thumb to gently wipe a stray tear from my cheek. "It is over," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he did not try to hide. "She can never hurt you again." We rode in silence for a time, the city passing by in a blur outside the window. He did not take me back to his house. Instead, we drove to a high ridge overlooking the city, a place where the sky seemed vast and close. We got out of the carriage and stood at the edge, a cool wind whipping strands of hair across my face. "I must apologize to you, Alara," he said, turning to face me. I looked at him, confused. "For what? You saved me." "I was too slow," he said, his jaw tight. "That forgery." For a few hours I allowed myself to believe it, to think that I had misread everything, that I had hoped for too much. The admission seemed to be wrenched from him. That was my own fear speaking, my own solitude. I almost let it blind me. I will not make that mistake again. He took both of my hands in his grip firm and warm. "I told you I do not play games, and I do not. And I am not a man for flowery words. So I will be direct." He looked into my eyes, and the last of his formidable walls seemed to crumble, revealing the lonely, brilliant man I had come to know. "My life has been a fortress, built to keep the world out, but you walked through the gates as if they were never there. You filled the silence. I do not want to return to that silence, Alara. I do not want to spend another day without your mind, your quiet strength, your presence." My heart felt as if it would beat its way out of my chest. "I am not asking you to be my duchess in a social sense," he continued, his voice thick with intensity. "I am asking you to be my partner, my intellectual equal, my friend, the person I discuss the stars with. I'm asking you to help me finish building my home and then to fill it with life. I'm asking you to be my wife, a real wife." He was not rescuing me. He was inviting me. He was offering a partnership of mind and soul. He was offering me a place where I would not just be seen, but celebrated. Tears pricked my eyes again, but this time they were tears of profound, overwhelming joy. "Yes," I whispered. "Alaric." "Yes." His face transformed. The harsh lines softened, and a slow, genuine smile spread across his lips. It was like watching the sun break through storm clouds, a thing of rare and breathtaking beauty. He lifted a hand and gently cupped my jaw, his thumb stroking my cheek. "Alara," he murmured, his voice full of wonder, as if he were saying my name for the first time. And then he lowered his head and kissed me. It was not a tentative, gentle kiss. It was a kiss of profound significance, of certainty and relief, a kiss that sealed a promise. It was the end of a very long winter and the beginning of everything else. It tasted of the wind and of a future I had never dared to imagine. 1 year later, I stood on the balcony of the newly completed Blackwood Manor. The night was clear and cold, the sky a velvet cloth scattered with diamonds. Alaric came to stand behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist and pulling me back against his chest. He rested his chin on my shoulder, his warmth a familiar comfort. We stood in a companionable silence, watching the constellations wheel overhead. Below us, the library was a beacon of golden light. Our library. It was the heart of our home, a 2-story marvel of his design and my curation, filled with our books, our maps, our shared passions. My father, now living quietly on a small country property, had visited last week. He was a changed man, humbled and remorseful, slowly rebuilding a relationship with the daughter he had almost lost. Clarissa, too, had found her own path. Free from her mother's influence, Beatrix having retired in disgrace to a remote corner of the continent, she had married a kind, if not titled, gentleman and was discovering a personality beyond her reflection in the mirror. We had found a tentative, surprising friendship. "What are you thinking about?" Alaric murmured, his lips brushing my ear. I smiled, leaning my head back against his shoulder. "I was thinking about a question," I said softly, "the one I asked Professor Albright 5 years ago." 6 years ago now, he corrected gently. 6 years, I amended. I thought it was a moment of foolishness, of being too loud, too visible. For years I was ashamed of it. I turned in his arms to face him, placing my hands on his chest. I looked up into his beloved, serious face, the gray eyes that had first seen me when no one else had. But it was the moment my life truly began. It was the first star I followed that led me home. To you. He brought his hand up to trace the line of my jaw, his expression soft with a love that still, after all this time, took my breath away. And I, he said, his voice a low, steady promise against the vastness of the night sky, will spend the rest of my life being grateful that I was there to see it shine.